So last year, our office at NASA released a report that declared in its very first sentence that America today stands at the opening of a second space age. The second space age, the report continued, is being brought about by a combination of initiatives, both at NASA and in the private sector, that together are expanding the nation's opportunities for exploration and ultimately for the economic development of the solar system. Now, these are some bold statements, even by the standards of the sometimes rather effusive prose that emerges from Washington, D.C. And so I was very happy when Pat invited me here to tell you about the report and explain to you why I think that that statement is merited. What we did in the report was lay out the different initiatives and factors, both internal and external to NASA, that we at NASA see as laying the foundation for this second space age. There are, of course, the references to the NASA programs that you would expect. The success of the International Space Station as a locus for developing our exploration technologies and for developing new economic activities. The development of NASA's commercial crew and cargo programs that stand to support our ISS operations and enable the commercialization of low Earth orbit. Mentions, of course, of the advancements of critical space technologies that NASA is engaged with, from solar electric propulsion to laser communications, as well as a description of the nationwide network of NASA centers, projects, and industry support structures that the agency has developed in its over 50 years of leadership in space. But there are also, somewhat more unusually for a NASA report, entire sections dedicated to describing the private sector forces that are changing the landscape of American spaceflight in tandem with our programs at NASA. NASA traditionally does not discuss the spaceflight objectives and activities of companies unless they're directly tied to a NASA project or program. And yet my office, the Emerging Space Office within the Office of the Chief Technologist, was formed in recognition of the rising importance within the landscape of American spaceflight of private sector individuals and organizations that are investing their own time and money in space activities. And the office was established to conduct economic research and report the findings both to NASA and to the public. And so the report frames the study of American spaceflight in a different way than I think we're used to seeing from the agency. It describes how in the long history of American space exploration, stretching back to the early American astronomical observatories and the early liquid fuel rocketry development efforts, it was private sector philanthropists and entrepreneurs that were leading the way. And how new American space companies today are forming and pursuing their own objectives in space with or without NASA support. And also how the unlikely combination of garage inventors, Kickstarter campaigns, and state-level initiatives are bringing new energy and new capital to the table. And how the prospect of private sector suborbital and orbital spaceflight may yet one day transform our nation from being a spacefaring nation to being a nation of spacefarers. So in the limited time I have here today, I want to sketch out the highlights of the report and give my perspective on the story that it tells. And in the process, I hope to convince you that the fact that NASA has released a report of this type signals something important about the ongoing shift in the national dialogue, about the potential role of the private sector and private initiatives in both achieving NASA's mission and in developing new capabilities for American spaceflight and space development. So the story begins by laying some of the background to a current moment in history. Describes, of course, the now familiar story of NASA's founding and the early historic successes from Explorer 1 to the Space Shuttle, as well as highlighting that the next major steps in spaceflight capability development are already underway with the SLS and Orion programs. But then it goes on to recognize the fact that sustaining the expansion of our frontiers in space will also require fresh ideas and new approaches, and that the emerging space industry, having been sparked by the initiative of private entrepreneurs and dedicated to creating new markets for goods and services in space, will be integral to helping NASA continue to explore space and help the nation expand the space economy and sustain that exploration. Although it is not NASA's responsibility to ensure the success of these independent private sector ventures, as the U.S. federal agency responsible for advancing American civil space technologies and civil spaceflight capabilities, NASA has a robust suite of programs that are helping to advance, purchase services from, and transfer technologies to emerging U.S. private sector space projects. And I would argue that nowhere is this new entrepreneurial energy and NASA's active support of it more in evidence than on the International Space Station. The ISS has become a frontier industrial and development hub, as well as, of course, the focal point for a wide array of innovative NASA programs, approaches that are supporting commercial space development. As an economist, by training, what indicates me here are the economic indicators. And I think the economic indicators with regard to the ISS are very interesting. We have, of course, 6 people living on a rotating space station, not a rotating space station, 6 rotating crew members on a currently non-rotating space station. Just making sure you're all awake. Coming from over a dozen countries. And it's actually become a small little economy of its own, full of exchanges, barter agreements, new entrants, and even middlemen merchants. Of course, 2 new U.S. commercial cargo delivery vehicles have been developed through the need to maintain supplies for the station, and 2 new U.S. crew vehicles are under development in order to deliver crew to the station once again from American soil. These 2 new crew vehicles, Boeing Starliner and SpaceX's Dragon, will also, for the first time in the history of American spaceflight, be privately owned and operated, with the companies having the legal right to sell those human spaceflight services to others. I think this represents a sea change in the potential for American private space activity. It represents the potential dawning of a new commercial era in low Earth orbit and potentially beyond. And ISS's contribution to the emerging space sector certainly don't stop there. Many of the most prominent new venture capital-backed companies of the past few years, Planet Labs, EarthCast, NanoRacks, Spire, Maiden Space, Planetary Resources, have all relied on the International Space Station at some point in their business. In addition, Bigelow Aerospace is set to add the first private module to the ISS with its beam module next year under contract to NASA. The ISS has, in essence, become a version of the frontier port economy that people have long hoped it would become. Perhaps not in the shape that people had expected, and perhaps not run with as much free market fervor as some people had initially hoped for. But it has been the center of the world's human spaceflight activities for over 2 decades, and I would argue that it has been the critical enabling program element for the renewed private sector interest and investment in spaceflight capability that we're seeing today. Another central element for the emerging space companies has been the infrastructure and expertise provided by NASA's centers and workforce. Although NASA's programmatic contributions to the development of commercial spaceflight I think are pretty well known, what gets sometimes less attention is the work that's being done at the technical level at the centers. Every center has contributed directly to supporting and enabling private sector space efforts. At NASA Ames, we developed the Pika material that has become the heat shield for Dragon. And it was at NASA Ames that the team that became Planet Labs was initially brought together under Ames's small spacecraft division. The team at Johnson Space Center has been integral in the development of commercial crew and cargo capabilities, supporting Blue Origin, Sierra Nevada, Boeing, and SpaceX with engineering support and testing, with over 1,000 served requests for NASA engineering drawings and data products to aid in the knowledge transfer from NASA's legacy of accumulated knowledge to these commercial space firms. Stennis Space Center has served as a major test stand for Blue Origin's BE-3 engine. Marshall Space Flight Center has supported Virgin Galactic's engine development, as well as 200 other companies. And of course, Kennedy Space Center has transformed itself to become a new hub of private sector space activities, with orbital and even prospective lunar companies choosing to base themselves at the historic Cape. All told, NASA centers are bringing a century of heritage and expertise to assisting with the development of American spaceflight capabilities and have provided a major part of the national base of physical and intellectual infrastructure upon which the emerging commercial space sector is now building. Through these types of support, we now have a NASA aerospace economy that has been extended to every state in the Union, thanks in part to the Space Grant Consortium program, which supports STEM education activities in all 50 states as well as DC and Puerto Rico. NASA has also recently expanded our CubeSat launch initiative to target launching independently built CubeSats from every state in the Union, with a hope that someday soon, every single state will have the capability to build its own spacecraft at a basic level. So while spaceflight technology began in the early 20th century as a passion of lone individuals and small groups of enthusiasts, NASA as a federal institution has transformed the pursuit of spaceflight from the private domain of a few to a national endeavor and helping to create a vibrant space industry in the process. But increasingly, I think it's important to recognize what those early origins of space exploration in this country can tell us about what we're seeing today. This map describes what I like to call the pre-NASA space economy. And it was included in the report of a recognition that prior to the existence of NASA, American citizens were already pursuing and funding, largely privately, the development of space exploration technologies. Most extensive of these technologies was, of course, the large astronomical observatories. They represented some $8 billion in today's terms of private sector investment from philanthropists, as well as civic communities, up until about 1958. course, there were also liquid fuel rocketry development efforts ongoing in the private sector as well, with Robert Goddard's efforts garnering over $35 million of private sector funding before any significant military interest in liquid fuel rocketry. So when we consider the role of the private sector in the future of American spaceflight and the evolution that we're seeing today, I believe it is crucial to remember that prior to NASA's formation, the US was already a global hub of development for astronomy, spaceflight technology, and for grand ambitions for the exploration of space, with dozens of private societies that you can see on the map, from the American Rocket Society to my very favorite, the Peoria Rocket Society, being established across the country and working to try and make this dawn of a space age a reality. And so leadership by private individuals was characteristic of how space exploration began in the United States, and I think it's characteristic of the renewed private sector interest in space exploration today. It was private capital from people like Andrew Carnegie, Charles Yerkes, and James Lick that built America's first major astronomical observatories in the 19th century. And it was through the support of the Guggenheim family that Robert Goddard was able to pursue his advanced work in liquid fuel rocketry. And if you listen to Buzz Aldrin, which of course we all should, you'll understand that it was actually his father that put Charles Lindbergh in touch with, put Charles Lindbergh and Guggenheim and Robert Goddard all in touch, because get this, Buzz's dad was actually a student of Robert Goddard's at Clark University. Shows you how small this community can be sometimes. But I think it's an incredible statement to the long historical process that we're all a part of. So these investments in private sector observatories were not commercially motivated on the whole, but nor were they driven by governmental interest either. In the long historical perspective, the motive force behind space exploration has been the intrinsic motivations of individuals for much longer than there has been either governmental or commercial support for it. That the well-motivated, well-resourced individual has been a historical mainstay allows us to see the efforts of Paul Allen, Robert Bigelow, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk in a broader historical context, and also allows us to appreciate that those types of private investors in spaceflight and space exploration are likely to be a mainstay of the future as well. I think this has implications for both the form and extent of partnerships that may be viable as NASA begins to explore beyond low Earth orbit once again. The historic reemergence of private sector investment in space, coupled with ongoing NASA programs and initiatives, has combined to result in an unprecedented array of new ventures being formed that are pursuing a wide range of objectives that stretch from suborbital tourism to asteroid mining. NASA has served as a partner and a customer for many of these firms, supporting the growth and ambition of new entrants, and we are encouraged to see new entities continue to emerge that are motivated by the same passion and independence of vision for the future that we find at NASA. Although we can only guess at which ventures will actually succeed in their missions and which ones will actually succeed in raising enough capital to make significant progress towards their goals, what we do know is that it is healthy to see such an expansion of companies that have ambitions of serving private and commercial markets in space as well as governmental missions. And perhaps one of the most significant shifts has been the emergence of, I think, what we can kind of think of as a new category of space traveler, which might be called citizen astronauts. Since 2001, 7 individuals have paid tens of millions of dollars each to visit the International Space Station through our Russian partners, and there are now more and more individuals around the world looking to experience space for themselves, whether on a suborbital flight, high-altitude balloon, or an orbital flight. I think that the numbers here are very telling. In 2013, when NASA had its last call for an astronaut corps, we chose 8 out of 6,300 applicants. By comparison, about 850 people have reserved tickets for suborbital flight through either Virgin Galactic or X-Corps. And although we still await the emergence of private suborbital vehicles, the numbers make it clear that there is demand in the American public for direct access and use of space greater than what any single organization can provide. And the great interest in the space experience and the emergence of private spaceflight capabilities suggests that someday the United States may yet have a multiplicity of different astronaut corps in addition to NASA's. There's also growing recognition of the importance of the contributions made by those American citizens who don't just want to go to space, but who want to engage in the process of building their own hardware to explore and utilize it. Sometimes called garage inventors or makers or hackers, the origins of spaceflight technology originated at the level of the motivated individual building the hardware to make it happen. This was true for Robert Goddard and the small team of technicians that all relocated with him to Roswell, New Mexico to help develop the first gyroscopically stabilized liquid fuel rocket. It's also true of Tom Mueller, who was building his own engines in a warehouse on the edge of the Mojave when Elon Musk approached him and invited him to co-found SpaceX. And it was true of my former colleagues at NASA Ames, who were building their first CubeSat for Planet Labs in their Cupertino garage. And at NASA, we've recognized not only the potential contribution of the garage inventor, but we've established a number of program mechanisms to allow independent innovators to contribute directly to NASA's mission. I think most people are familiar with the Centennial Challenges program, but NASA has also been an early leader and adopter in crowdsourcing engineering solutions, establishing the NASA Tournament Lab and the NASA Innovation Pavilion to help enable low-cost software development and algorithmic solutions that directly map to challenges that the engineers at NASA are facing. NASA has also, of course, launched over 35 educational nanosatellites with dozens more to come. And just as importantly, independent groups are now using online crowd fundraising platforms to basically fund their own hands-on technology projects, which my favorite of which was the NASA ISEE-3 mission, where individuals paid to commandeer time on the Arecibo telescope to basically become the first organization to operate a spacecraft in deep space, all funded through an online platform. So at the heart of these emerging trends are motivated individuals who are pursuing their own mission in space, and NASA really is proud to be a supporter and enabler of many of them. And of course, at the state level too, individual states have recognized the potential for economic benefits that can accrue with space activities, with investments in spaceports, tax credits being provided by legislation, as well as other types of legislation that are attracting new space businesses to new states. Of course, the efforts here in New Mexico with Spaceport America, I think, are well known to us. But I think it's also worth paying attention to some of the less well-known efforts. Millions of dollars being appropriated by the state of Hawaii for lunar analog support on the Big Island of Hawaii, or the Zero-G, Zero-Tax Act that was passed by the Virginia State Legislature. This increased state-level legislative and gubernatorial action is a meaningful signal that perceived economic importance of emerging space activities nationwide. All right, so what do all of these programs and trends mean for the future? In the report, we outlined one potential future as it may be in 2044. But more significant, I think, than what we included in that speculative vision was an explicit recognition that what 2044 will look like will depend as much on the individuals, private sector corporations, and foundations as it does depend on what NASA does. The report explicitly presented only one possible future with the recognition that all three sets of destinations described, near-Earth asteroids, Mars, and the Earth-Moon system, are expected to be critical parts of space development in the decades to come, and that we should realistically expect them to take on different levels of prioritization at different times depending on political, economic, and technological circumstances. And as a sign of NASA's growing openness to private sector activities, the section on Mars in 2024 describes the human exploration of the red planet as being the result of cooperative partnerships between governments and private entities, even going so far as to imagine that prior to the first human steps on Mars, NASA and privately financed expeditions may travel to Mars orbit and visit Phobos in order to validate systems in preparation for the historic expedition to the Martian surface. And so while we set our sights at NASA on the journey to Mars, we also recognize that 50 years after the creation of NASA, our long-term goal is no longer just to reach one destination. Our long-term goal is the development of the capabilities that will allow the American people to explore, pioneer, and expand our human sphere of activity into the solar system. So in the long term, in other words, we are going to be exploring space forever. To do this, we will build on our long-standing relationships with American industry by embracing new and diverse forms of partnership. Private sector leadership in space exploration was the normal state of affairs in America before the foundation of NASA. And today we have recognized the advantage of that earlier model in terms of private sector energy and initiative, combined it with NASA's legacy of technical expertise and programmatic accomplishment, and are working to lay the foundation of a second space age. Space exploration of the future will come about through the combination of efforts of the government, private industry, scientists, students, and citizens, each playing unique and essential roles. NASA is proud to recognize that American spaceflight, after sparking, nurturing, and carrying its flame for over half a century, is not just about us anymore. This economic and cultural transition in the American space industry and in American spaceflight culture is an exciting one, and will further NASA's mission of advancing exploration and discovery. Our continued national leadership in spaceflight relies on the ability to adapt our habits and strategies for success when needed. NASA will continue to be the world leader in space exploration. It is that role of leadership that is expected of NASA by American citizens and by the world. But it is also exciting to consider that as we move farther into the 21st century, that leadership may be expressed as much by the American private sector space activities that NASA supports and enables as it is by our own missions. Realizing this broader role of leadership is a significant part of the challenge and the adventure that I think lies before us. Thank you very much.